Without further ado, let's bring him in. Our feature presentation on today's show from the 32 Thoughts podcast, from Sportsnet, from Hockey Night in Canada. It's Elliotte Friedman. What's going on, E?
Not much, guys. How you guys doing? Jay, good to see you, man.
You too, man. I was pumping your tires a little bit earlier. Good to see you. And one of the good guys in the game, man. It's great to see you live.
It's great to see you, too. Enjoy listening to the show. I enjoy watching you guys. Like, I used to joke that Justin Bourne and Anthony Stewart, when they did a lot of radio together, I called them the arsonists. They used to set fire to everything. I'm glad to see that you guys have kind of picked up the slack. It's really good.
That's the best thing, because Rosie was just talking. He's like, how does Elliotte Friedman know, A, that I did a show, and B, even remember me from the NHL? But that's the one thing I've learned about you. You know everything, Elliotte.
Well, I don't know. I would say that. I think there's a lot of stuff that goes on out there that you don't know. But the thing I really remember about Jay was when he got called up to the Leafs. Well, first of all, like, the thing is, you always have great respect. Like, if you play one game in the NHL, you're the elite of the elite. Like, just to play one game in the NHL makes you an elite player. But I remember, Jay, Dallas Aikens told me a story that you got called up, I think, for like 10 games in a row. He started your line in the Marlies, and you guys went on an unbelievable tear. And I'm listening to what you were just saying about the Lightning in the first 5-10 minutes of a playoff series is all about banging and crashing. He said that you got called up after he started your line with the Marlies about 10 games in a row, and the Marlies had a great record. And he said that he wasn't surprised at all that you got your call up at that time, because you loved it. You just loved going out there and setting the tone and being on the ice for the first shift. You knew you were out there to run over people and let the opponent know that the Marlies meant business. So I always do remember that about you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That was a good time, Dallas. I loved his coaching style, and he put a little bit more faith in me than other guys did. And that line we had there, we were just we dumped the puck and crashed, and we were getting points off our asses and off our legs and all kinds of different things. It was a fun time. And then, when you do that down there, sometimes you get the call. So it was nice to be in that organization, being coached by Dallas for sure.
All right, Elliotte, let's get into the conversation. Obviously, the trade deadline, March 3rd. Looking forward to Sunrise next weekend as well. I'm sure you'll be there. So the trade conversation, is there a certain player that comes to mind right away that you think would be a perfect fit for the Toronto Maple Leafs right now?
Well, I'm one of those people who wonders if they should be looking more to forward than defense. I am. But I think the question is not what we think, it's what do they think. And I think since Muzzin's been out, their default has been, we have to get a defenseman that plays like Muzzin does. Now, I think at times, because of the way their D has played this year, that they have, I don't know if wavered is the right answer, but I do think internally they have thought, are we good enough here to go start focusing on something else? And the number one thing I think they've said internally is we have time, because they probably won't be able to do much until right before the deadline. So we better be sure. I think the way their D is played has given them some rethinking on this. I just think at the end of the day, look, there's the regular season and there's the playoffs. They are two different leagues. And people blame the referees, and I get it. But the bottom line is, I'm one of those people who believe that players change more than the officials do. That you cannot play 28 games in the playoffs. You cannot play 82 games in the regular season like you play 28 games in the playoffs. It's just not possible. I think it's a rougher, meaner, nastier game. And I think that put it this way, any defenseman who could be available, I think they've called on them. I think they've called the team and said, what are you thinking? What are you looking at? What's it going to cost us? What are we going to need to do? And I think they've collected all that information. Any forward who's been available, I think they've done that to some degree too. But what I think the biggest question is going to be, what do they think they need? Because I do think it was a Muzzin type the moment he went down. But at the very least, I think they've reconsidered or taken a look at what does this mean the way that D has played this year.
We've seen a lot of line shuffling in the bottom six lately, and maybe there's just me just free thinking, but do you think the Leafs are quietly setting the table potentially for like an Engvall or a Kerfoot going out the door to free up some money if they have to do something substantial here?
Yes, I do think that's a possibility. The one thing I think about Dubas is he will do things like that. I don't think he's afraid of things like that. The one thing about Kerfoot in particular, and I have been told this several times, that don't forget that Keefe really trusts him. Keefe really trusts Kerfoot. I'm freaked out by my picture being up in two of these sides of the screens here. I'm completely mesmerized by it. But like, and right now, as you showed, he's on the fourth line. And what I think, this is my opinion, but I know that Keefe really trusts Kerfoot. I know that he hasn't scored as much as everybody would have hoped, but if you watch him, he gets put out in situations that you don't get put out in unless the coach believes you can do a job. And I think that and I know the organization listens to Keefe on this kind of thing. They do trust their coach. They trust his opinion. My belief is before they move on for Kerfoot, they have to convince Keefe that there are other options. I think they'd like Holmberg to be one of those guys. They were really hoping that Holmberg would be a player this year. Even though his faceoffs are a little bit of a struggle, he's showing that he's going to be something. But in Kerfoot's case in particular, I think they're going to have to convince Keefe that he can't do the job, or someone can do the job better.
Rosie, you got one?
Yeah, and like, talk a little bit, Elliotte. I mean, you go on Twitter and you're looking around to fans and people who aren't really in the game as much, and they'll say things like just trade Kerfoot and trade Engvall and do this and do that, and they don't understand like how hard is it to put together not just a trade, but a trade that you feel like you're winning. You don't just make a trade for the sake of making it, but like for someone to take Kerfoot at $3.5 million or Engvall at almost $2.5 million is a difficult thing to do, and you got to convince them to give you something that you think is even more valuable than that when those guys probably aren't even playing up to their cap crunch right now. So just put in perspective how difficult it is for GMs to work those phones and to actually get a deal in place.
I think it is hard. I think it's really hard this year, Jay, when and the phrase I use is constipated. We've got a constipated league because there's no cap room and so many teams are at LTIR. I think that makes it even more difficult. Kerfoot's case is a little interesting because most of his salary is paid. So I think the good thing about Kerfoot is that his bonus is done. So like his actual cash is very low, and I think that will make him attractive. In a lot of cases, Jay, yes, you have to attach something to move these players. The one thing I'm starting to wonder about here, though, is I'm beginning to wonder if this is going to be a buyer's market. I've heard there are some teams out there that are trying to sell who are a little bit worried that there aren't going to be a ton of buyers, and therefore the sellers are worried that they might, be the person who goes home alone at the bar at 2 a.m. if they don't do something. So, and I think some of the buyers are really hoping that's the case, that some of the sellers might panic. We'll see if that happens.
Yeah, the Montreal Canadiens are one team that comes to mind right away, even like an asset like Sean Monahan's had a pretty good season, but you look at the center depth in the market at that front, so it should be intriguing on that front. The name that always comes up, as you know, in the Maple Leafs market, Matthew Nyes. If the right deal comes along, is it your understanding the Leafs would be open to having that conversation?
Well, the one thing I think about Dubas is he doesn't shut anything down, but I think he has guidelines. Like I remember last year, he told teams that he's not trading knives for a rental. Like he's not doing that, and I would suspect that's still the same. You know, the one thing I think about a lot is I think a lot about Anthopoulos and the way he left, and Anthopoulos took his shot. And the reason he took his shot was, if you'll remember, the Blue Jays didn't have a great record that year, but their run differential was excellent. And he took a shot based on that, and he proved that he was right to take that shot. I think Dubas will take a shot with this team because I think they're good. Like, what's the biggest challenge Toronto has? You guys have talked about it. They're getting a team who's lost one playoff series in 3 years in the first round of the playoffs. The division is brutal, and that's what they've got. I think Dubas will take a shot. I just think that the one thing about him is that he said he won't do Nyes for a rental. And I would be very surprised to see him change that stance.
Couple more and I'll get you out of here. So we had Anthony Stewart, my good buddy, on the show last week. You guys had a fantastic panel. I think it was last week where you polled on the next Pasternak contract, what that would look like. So we're going to translate that to the Leafs world because there's a guy named Willie Nylander. Elliott's having a remarkable year, eligible for a new contract as early as next summer. What's that next contract look like for Nylander in your opinion?
Well, I think I'm going to use the old Lamorello line here. If you have time, use it. And because you got to do Matthews first. Like, I think they're going to want to have Matt. Like, there's no way we can go into next year without Matthews signed. No way. Like, can you imagine the gong show that's going to be all of next season if Matthews enters the year unsigned? Like, you will not be able to talk about anything else. William Nylander just set a new NHL record with 14 points against the Sabres. I'm sorry, how does this affect Austin Matthews' next deal? There's no way that the Leafs are going into next year without that. Now, I am of the belief that Matthews will resign. I'm not convinced it will be long-term, but I think he will resign. And then we'll see where the cap goes. Like the thing is that one of the things that we've learned here is that, you know, the Toronto players, and a lot of this generation of players is like this. None of them really took discounts. And it's easier to take discounts when you're winning. And that at that point in time, they hadn't won yet. Like the Canucks, when they had the Sedins, they took their biggest discount when the team could win the Stanley Cup. I'm really curious to see what all of these deals are going to look like if the players really believe they have a chance to win here. But Matthews goes first. Matthews goes first.
That's fair. And again, we'll see what happens come the springtime, but certainly the conversation will evolve after that, considering everything that happens beforehand. So last question. I've always wanted to ask you this and never have. You taught me at the College of Sports Media, if you do recall, for a couple months. We worked together at Sportsnet. How does one become an NHL insider is a question I've always wanted to ask you.
You know, I think it's FaceTime. Like, you know, I've been around now. I'm an old man now, Nick. I've been around 30 years in the business. You know, I've been at Hockey Night in Canada. This is 20 years. And I think it's just, you know, it's being around. And, you know, the thing that Jay talked about there, like, it's a big deal. Like, players talk about this person's a good guy, this person's an ass. You can trust them, you can't trust them. Like, nobody's going to be happy with you all the time. Like this whole thing with Vancouver, like, you know, I was right in the middle of that, and it wasn't an easy thing because, you know, it was crazy town. And people aren't going to be happy with you all the time, and people aren't going to like you all the time. But at the end of the day, like, do you show your face? Like, you know, if you say something, you know, negative, do you show your face and answer the bell? Or do you run away? Or do you just show up? Like, players know. Like, I remember the first year of the Raptors, one of the Raptors players told me, I can never remember your name, but I see you here every day. And like, that's the thing, like, who's there every day? And generally, even though nobody's going to be happy with you all the time, do you try to treat people well? And I do. I'm not perfect, but I try.
I remember you on Headline Sports like it was yesterday. Elliotte, really, really appreciate time, man. This is a lot of fun.
All right, guys. By the way, I did want to mention something else too, Nick. Like, I heard Frank Saravelli's report on Jake McCabe about what it would cost to get him. I thought that was really interesting, and in particular that Frank had mentioned that McCabe didn't have Toronto on his no trade list. Like, I don't think Toronto's going to pay that price for McCabe. I looked into that one specifically, so I did want to mention that. I thought it was a great report by Frank, but I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced Toronto's going there for that.
Sounds good. I think Timo Meier's the guy they should go after. Okay.
You know, I really love that on Meier, and because the one thing I think about Meier is that like, the thing with the Leafs is you could do it and then flip him. And Dubas is the kind of guy who would think like that. Now the price is going to be enormous. Like, that's the one thing. Like, you know, Toronto doesn't have a ton of cap room. They don't have a ton of picks, and they want to keep their picks. I don't know if they have the juice to pull that deal off. Like, I think New Jersey is the team to watch there. I think that's the team that has made it clear they like Meier and would really like to do it. So my question is, can Toronto outbid the Devils? And I think you look up and down and you see if they can do that.